going to talk about how light gauge fishing actually came about. It's a technique rather than a hook that we use. There's a lot of misconception about how it actually came about because it has a lot of issues, and if you don't use the techniques properly, you are going to have trouble with the hooks. So how it all came about is when I was in Cape Verde, I started to learn that we could catch some really, really big fish with light drag and using drag change. And drag change was the big secret. So how we went about catching big fish back then was keep the drag very light. At the start of the fight, it changed the fish behavior completely. The fish would stay up on the surface a lot. It was allowed me to maneuver the boat back towards the fish. And as soon as we're only using just enough drag to gain line at this point. And what it did is allowed the fish to stay up on the surface, allowed me to chase it with the boat. And as the fish went down, I would use, come up on the drag, and that drag change would change the behavior of the fish quite often. And bring it back to the surface, I'd back the drag off and I could chase it again. And what the secret was trying to use as little drag as possible to gain line to give you the biggest drag change. As opposed to traditionally setting the reel at 1/3 of the breaking straight of the line and fighting the fish at that, which wouldn't give you as much drag change when the fish went deep, and it wouldn't keep the fish up on the surface as much. Keeping that drag very light allowed the fish to stay up on the surface. Now, I learnt this from guys that were white marlin fishing with dink baits. You see that they don't wind the line tight very often. They're just basically winding in a lot of slack line on these fish, and the fish will stay up on the surface. You hear the captain going to the angler, "Don't wind it tight, don't wind it tight." And that allows the fish to stay up, allows the skipper to get the boat in a position to back down on the fish a lot more, because the fish is on the surface. But as I say, I learnt to catch these big fish with the light drag and the change of drag. So it got me thinking and going, okay, what's the biggest problem we have is actually hooking these fish. So I thought, well, we can actually use a smaller hook, a lot thinner hook, and that's what it is about the thickness of the hook. That's the secret to these light gauge hooks. So the problem with it, though, is they're nowhere near as strong. So until we had that technique of using a light drag and a change of drag, the hook would never have worked if we fished with that traditional 1/3 of the drag. So I've got this technique. I'm going to give these little hooks a try and see what happens, because what we're trying to achieve with light gauge hooks is strictly hooking the fish, because if you don't hook the fish, you haven't got a chance. So if you hook the fish, you've got a chance. Well, we'll deal with it once we've got the fish at least hooked. It's given us a chance to catch that fish. And that's all light gauge hooks are designed to do, is to increase the amount of fish that we actually hook. Then it's up to you to learn the techniques that I talk about to be able to catch that fish. So at the start, I used all sorts of different hooks. I used jig hooks, I used light gauge, like fly fishing hooks. And what I found is the thinner the hook, the better. The only problem with that was the thinner we went, the less strength that the hooks had. So I set about developing the light gauge hook that we have now, the platinum light gauge hook, which is a cross between a jig hook and a fly fishing hook. It, very, very sharp, but still uses the technology of the jig hooks, which are very, very strong. I'm sure all of you know that when that hook is buried, when you're jigging, buried in that fish, that it's very, very strong. You can pull very, very hard. And that's the same thing with these light gauge hooks. Now, they do have their issues with only just piercing the tip of the hook into the fish. That is when it's at its weakest moment, and you probably wouldn't have hooked it with a traditional big hook. So I'm going to run through a couple of techniques that you can use to try to help yourself stay connected to these fish and give yourself the best chance of catching them when you're using these light gauge hooks. So At the start of the fight is the most crucial moment. As the fish eats, that's when you're going to have most of your problems. Now, as the fish is ripping line, all you're trying to do at this stage is stay connected to the fish. You are never, ever, ever going to stop it. Doesn't matter how much drag you put on it, you're only going to break something. So don't think you're going to stop the fish by putting more drag on. So at this stage, I will fish with my reel set at 5 kilos, okay? That's my magic number, is 5 kilos. As the fish eats the lure, I will actually back the drag back down to 2 or 3 kilos, just enough to stop it overrunning, okay? The reason for this is all I'm trying to do at this stage is stay connected to the craziness that the fish is doing, the jumping and the fast running. So a really good thing to keep in your mind here is when the fish is running, keep the drag very light, okay? It's like a piece of mono. Say you got a piece of 30-pound mono. If you snap it quickly like that, you know it's going to break very easily. If you pull it in a slow pull like that, it's going to be very strong. And the hook is exactly the same thing. So at the start is your danger time when you're getting all that shock and that. You want to keep the drag very light. Now, I hear a lot of guys go, oh, I'm going to get spooled like that. And the straight out answer is yes, you are. But you need to start to chase the fish, okay? And chasing the fish, I mean, is normally turn the boat round, put it in gear, and most boats will do 4 to 5 knots in gear. So you'll cover a lot of ground, get a lot of line back, or manage the amount of line lost, okay? So at this point, all the angler is doing is basically gaining line when they can, and they're only using enough drag to gain line. So if you can gain line at 3 or 4 kilos, that's all you use. If you can't, just slowly come up on the drag until you can gain the line, okay? Up to a point of, say, 6 to 7 kilos, okay? So once you've started to gain the line, and the secret is keeping the drag as light as possible at this stage. So you're only using just enough drag to gain line. So what that'll do, that'll help to keep the fish up on the surface. Now eventually it'll want to go down. So as the fish goes down, don't be scared. In a slow pull, when the fish is slowed down, to come up on the drag to your 6, 7 kilos and pull on the fish. Even a little bit of hand pressure at this stage is a good thing too, because you can back it off very, very quickly. Okay, so what you'll find is as the fish goes down, you'll hit it with some drag. You'll watch the rod tip. Quite often it'll bounce, and next minute the fish will be back up on the surface again, and you can repeat the process. So that is the very basic, the nucleus of light gauge fishing. So if you can keep in your head with this hook, because as I say, the hook is strong when it's buried deep. When it's only just in the tip, it's not so strong. That's the point where you'll have the trouble. So you need to stay with it. And the other thing is too, keeping the drag lighter. You'll find a number of times that you'll get a fish to the boat and it's like, geez, if we would have used a lot of drag here, we would have just ripped the hooks clean out. So it's more about angling as opposed to winding, what we've traditionally done in the past. And it's certainly not that drag and stag mentality. There's quite a bit to play from the angler and the crew to put the boat in the right place and that kind of thing. So that is how light gauge hooks came around. So they came around by learning to catch big fish with heavy tackle and learning change of drag, what it does to the fish. And that's what led on to using these light gauge hooks. So as I said before, I mentioned about the white marlin fishing guys that I learned from. When I was there, watching them catch their white marlin with the ballyhoo, the dink fishing, and that I saw that we got a lot of bycatch of 200 to 300 pound blue marlin on those 20 to 30 pound outfits, and I was like, that's the traditional size of a striped marlin in New Zealand. I'm going to give it a go and try to catch them on small lures and a small light gauge hook. So I set up a spread of 4 small lures, and what I'm trying to do with these hooks is I'm trying to actually hook the fish in the mouth, and as deep as possible in the mouth, because what happens is when that hook, as I mentioned, when it's buried deep, going back to the thing about jigging, you know, everyone knows they can pull really, really hard on a jig, hooked fish, that those hooks when they're deep are very, very strong, okay? So what I'm trying to do is use a small bait, so when the fish comes and eats that lure, it's got its best chance of getting 2 hooks, or at least 1 hook buried deep into the mouth of the fish. Now, that's the reason why I use 2 hooks, is simply to try to get as much holding power as possible, okay? And that's the reason why I use the small style of lure like that, okay? Now, being a typical fisherman, I was always very worried that my boat wouldn't raise as many fish when I went down to using smaller lures when I was marlin fishing. So I added a couple of things to my spread when I set the boat up. I put a dredge on it, and I put a big teaser chain in there as well into the mix. So I was running 4 lures with a couple of dredges and a couple of teaser chains. Very, very similar to dink fishing for white marlin, but using lures instead. Now, the reason I did that is because using the small lures, I didn't think I had enough profile in the water to raise the fish. I was always very worried. The teasers allowed me to put that big profile in my spread, bigger lures that I couldn't tow on rods and reels. So that gave me the big presence that I wanted, and then it gave me the 4 little lures out the back there that carried the hooks that were my targets. So I feel that doing that, and from results wise, made a big difference to one, not only the amount of fish I raised. I had no problem raising fish, but it made a big difference to the actual bite to catch rate by using the smaller profile lures with these light gauge hooks. I've done very, very well using these hooks. Now, when I go to set my spread up as far as lures go, it's really, really simple. I like to troll 4 little lures, as I said, and I like to troll a combination of lures. I like to troll some angle face with a cut face lure opposite it, or a bullet lure. I'll always pull a bullet lure on my long rigger. They're absolutely deadly, especially on striped marlin. The only thing is they're quite hard to see sometimes when they're out there on your long rigger. So I'll run a bird in front of it, little bird like that, just so I can see where the lure is. But that's my basic spread when I go to set up for light gauge fishing. The only thing I do that's a little bit different is I get a lot of bycatch some days with using the small lures. I get a lot of little tunas and albacores and stuff like that, which is not a problem, but traditionally I'm targeting marlin. So I will put out some bigger lures like that in my spread. I'll show you how to rig those in another video, but I'd make a few modifications. But I like to put a bigger profile out, and that'll slow down the amount of bycatch that I get because it's normally too big for the bycatch to eat. So yeah, so that's how light gauge fishing came around. That's the style of spread that I'm using, and it's been highly successful over the years. Number of people have caught some really, really big fish on this gear now, not just the striped marlin, but a lot of blue marlin have been caught. Yeah, so that's how I fish my light gauge hooks.